I'm going to be talking about something that is going on right before our very eyes, right under our noses, that most people don't know about. And it's massive. I like Doug's word, massive. Let me go ahead and do my disclosure. So I have a company where I provide services online to people who can't follow directions because they have an addiction. Does anybody in here, if you've ever had a client where you just gave them this brilliant direction, insightful, everything they need to know, and they can't get started? Anybody have a client like that? Or how about one who's able to follow it for a certain amount of time and then relapses? Anybody have a client like that? Or somebody who just, you give them all the information and they just disappear into the night. Like you never see them again. Yeah. So what I am positing here is that it's because they have an addiction. And it's just like, the alcoholic comes in and the doctor or the health practitioner says, "Oh, you have alcoholism, just quit drinking." No, that does not work. So I will tell you, my journey started out, at conception. My, which time do we have? No, seriously, my grandfather was a candy store owner. Hello. My mother had a glass of caffeine and sugar in her hand like every moment of every day that I can remember. And she had a very volatile temper. So I didn't connect those two dots until I was 44 years old. And I was yelling at my kids the way she yelled at us. And I didn't want to be. That was the thing. I didn't want to be yelling at them. But I would just start yelling. And I would step over here and watch myself yelling at them and just thinking, would you stop that? So I was doing everything you can imagine. I was doing personal therapy. I was doing women's groups. I would even 12-step Codependence Anonymous group to get that personality under control. Because when I wasn't raging, I was bitching. So I had a wonderful husband and these two fabulous children, and I was just crabby all the time. And I didn't want to be. So I was doing all this stuff, but I was also yo-yo dieting. So I went to Oberlin College in Ohio, undergrad, and I majored in political science and economics. I worked at the Wisconsin legislature for 2 years as a fiscal analyst. And then I went to Stanford Business School, so switched over to business. Then I was 5 years in a Fortune 200 corporate office doing financial analysis. And you're like, okay, that is a really weird background for somebody who's now in a nutrition-related field, but it all came together. It all comes together in this presentation. So I had my two girls, my two kids, 83 and 84, and then I was too sick to go back to work. I had this prestigious degree and da-da-da. Well, I couldn't go back to work. I was sneezing all the time. My eyes were running. I was tired. I was crabby. And I think I could not go back to work, but I should have been able to go back to work. So I'm yo-yo dieting away after these pregnancies, doing 1,200 calories and then gaining it all back year after year. And then I got to a year in which I knew I didn't have the willpower to do that 1,200 calorie diet. There was a woman in my Codependence Anonymous group who just came up to me one day and said, "Why don't you try Food Addicts in Recovery?" I happened to be in a thin phase at that moment. I'm like, "Why are you telling me that?" Well, here's why she was telling me that, because she heard the sugar driving my behavior. I was doing everything in that. I had a sponsor, I was writing the steps, I was going to meetings, and the raging was continuing. Just like it continued through 10 years of therapy and 14 training weekends in a women's recovery group. So you can imagine, so I went and got the book. I don't want to go to the meetings, but I'll get the book. So of course I flip right to the food plan, because I'm not a food addict. I flipped right to the food plan, and on January 1st, 1996, I start doing the food plan. Immediately, I know it's not going to work. Way too much food. Way too much food on this food plan. But the miracle started 4 days into it. So I'm sitting at the table. I remember this like it was yesterday. I'm doing some work at the dining room table, and it gets to be noon. Like, it's noon. I haven't thought about food since breakfast. I didn't know that was possible. So when I went to kindergarten, first time away from the kitchen, I remember craving so bad. It was a long time ago, so it was the days when paste was still made from flour. And I'm looking at the paste and I said, I could eat that. I could eat that. I could eat that. I could eat my chapstick. I think I'll be okay. I learned how to tell time. I'm like, great, now I'll know when the snack is coming. I had met my first kid who would choose plain milk over chocolate milk. Like, you could have the chocolate milk. Why don't you get the chocolate milk? Like, I thought that was really impossible. So I had had cravings my entire life. My absolute first memory is of manipulating an ice cream truck driver into giving me something for free. First memory. Okay, so fast forward to now I'm 44 years old. I've had cravings every day of my life, but I didn't know I had cravings. If you had asked me the day before, do you have cravings? I would have said no. But when they went away, I knew what they were. I thought everybody's thought about food all day long. Not the case. So that day also the brain fog went away, and the mid-morning slump and the mid-afternoon slump and the evening slump just stopped. I woke up feeling like I had been asleep, as opposed to waking up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I was tired all the time. That stopped. It stopped on day 4. And then that weekend, I'd lost 2 pounds. Like, dang. But the real epiphany came. The reason why I adopted this as a career came in week 3. I can tell you exactly where I was standing in my kitchen. It was the evening. I was in Houston, Texas. And I thought, wow, I haven't had to yell at anybody in 3 weeks. Nobody's really messed up in 3 weeks. I haven't had a meltdown in 3 weeks. And it hit me. This is about the food. This isn't some magical 3-week period. This has something to do with the food. Pre-internet, could not just run over to my computer and look it up. I had to wait till Saturday, that was a Thursday, and get in my support group, because I had joined Food Addicts Anonymous 3 weeks earlier. And I go, so, I had to wait till the speaker stopped, you're no crosstalk, none of this, and to wait, and like, I have a question. And does everybody get less irritable on this food plan? 20 heads, yeah. 10 years of therapy, 14 weekends at women's groups, a year of desperate work in Codependence Anonymous. What's the friggin' food? What's the friggin' food? And specifically, it was sugars and flours. Anybody surprised? No. So it was the sugars and flours because that's all we knew about then. We only knew about the sugars and flours. Today, 23 years later, I have a list of 13 categories of food that I know are, the brain doesn't read them as food. The brain reads them as mood-altering substances. I have a list of like 13, okay? So when that happened in 1996, I immediately started to try to help other people because I was a raging codependent. So I wanted everybody to do this with me. My girls were in a little girls' school, and I talked to every parent, and I gave them a list. These are the good foods. Nobody did it. So like, okay, that was attempt number 1 to start a kind of Malcolm Gladwell tipping point movement in the whole country. Walking around this little girls' school with a handout So that didn't work. So I said, well, they just don't know how to do it. So I wrote a book over 3 years about my family's experience in this adaptation. My therapist gave me 4 rules, 3 weeks into it. My family was not allowed to bring processed foods into the house. They weren't allowed to eat it in front of me. They couldn't ask me to go get it, or they couldn't ask me to pay for it. So that was the whole enabling thing. And it worked. So what my family, my poor family, what happened is at the end of that 3 weeks when I realized, I'm giving my kids food that makes them irritable with me. I think I'll stop doing that. And everybody, these poor 3 people in my family, they noticed the difference was so stark. This nice person came and took the place of the witch. That when I sat down with them at 3 weeks to give them the 4 rules, I give them the 4 rules, and they're like, Mom, anything we can do to help you? Anything we can do to help you? No problem. We'll do it. You want to get the stuff out of the house? Okay, we'll get the stuff out of the house. Yeah. And fortunately also I'd kept my dieting to myself. I just calculated my calories. So it wasn't like the whole household had to live through 84 zillion diets over all those years. There was none of this, oh God, this Mom's next diet. It was just, whatever we can do to help you, Mom. And it worked. It worked incredibly well. So what these foods are, they're drugs. Body's interpreting them as drugs. Mind's interpreting them as drugs. And, so I started feeding my kids this way, and they just, their grades went up, their sports went up, their popularity went up, their confidence went up. In this little girls' school, and they're just running the school after a couple of months. It's like they just popped out like a flower just opens, but not just a daisy, as like a friggin' chrysanthemum. So, they went on to have these spectacular careers, and whenever I counsel people, I don't counsel people, I peer support people. I'm like, your kids are going to be different. They're going to be the ones that get into the top schools. They're going to be different, for sure. Get used to it. So I wrote the popular book, and I said, well, now everybody's going to know how to do this, and they're just going to do it. Not. That book stayed in the top 3% of Amazon books for 10 years. It did not meet Malcolm Gladwell's criteria for a tipping point, and it didn't create it. So I said, well, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to do TV. So I got with a producer, and a PBS producer in Houston, and she did quite a nice series of programs, and that didn't work either. So I said, dang. I thought, I'm going to get on national TV. Book was doing well. So talking to this producer in New York of one of those big morning talk shows, and they said, well, you don't have a degree in your field. You have this nice MBA, but you don't have a degree in your field, so we can't have you on our show. I'm like, well, I'll go get one. So fortunately, I grew up in Cincinnati, which is the home of Union Institute, which is the only school in the entire world which is geared towards people who want to create a new field. So I signed up there, and I had the privilege and liberty of being able to go straight through the program, 3 years. I earned a PhD in interdisciplinary studies with a specialization in addictive nutrition. I said, okay, now I'm going to teach the teachers. That will start the movement. Well, food addiction was still very hokey, and are you kidding? You can't be addicted to food. I'm addicted to food. Yeah, so that didn't work. I wrote papers, I wrote chapters for other people. It didn't set the world on fire. So I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to start a prepared meal company, and then I'll get people through withdrawal. They'll see how great they feel, and then they'll buy my products, and it'll be incredible. Did not happen. That's the, you're drinking too much, just stop drinking model. Didn't work. But it did yield one incredible story. So we were marketing to a high-end law firm, and the lawyers, I'd get on the phone with them after a week of these meals, and they'd be like, so this is a high-end, this is Fulbright Jaworski. These are the best lawyers on the planet. They're the cream of the crop from the law schools. So I'd get to the end of the week, and I'd call them up and ask them how they did. Like, well, I had some unusual things happen this week. Like, I seem to be thinking more clearly, and I'm not having the mid-morning, mid-afternoon slump, and my cravings went away. Like, dang, this has reached that level of our society. The highest functioning people in this country are impaired by processed foods. So that was worth the whole agony of having a 6.5-year company that I just hated going to. Sorry, I'm not a kitchen kind of person. So that was very useful. And then my dad died in Cincinnati. I was living in Houston. I'd gotten an unexpected divorce. And my 91-year-old Belgian sugar-addicted stepmom was on her own in Cincinnati, and CRC Press appeared and said, would you write the food addiction textbook for us? I'm like, let me think about it. Okay, yes. Okay, so that's where this story starts. The textbook came out last year. It took me 3 years. I looked at something like 6,000 or 8,000 studies. The textbook has 2,000 studies cited in it. Why is there so much research on food addiction and nobody's ever heard about it? Because all the research on obesity and eating disorders and drug addiction is illustrating addiction to processed foods. So that's why everything I said in that textbook except one thing, I could find a study that illustrated it. The one thing I could not find is blackout eating. Nobody has published on blackout eating, but it is a phenomenon. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about what happened in 1980. There was a shift, and that shift changed everything about the Western world, and now increasingly developing world. So before the 1980s, we ate food, real food. But after the 1980s, we ate, the same foods were being presented to us, but now they were addictive, food-like substances. Okay, and that's what I'm going to explain. Now, so here we are 30 years later, and we have to ask ourselves, are we addressing eating problems, or are we addressing an addiction? So we're going to talk about these topics this morning. The addiction epidemic model, who spreads food addiction, what is the impact on the brain, and what are we going to do about it? Specifically, I would like for you guys all to leave with understanding why your clients quit. Sometimes they quit before they've begun, so that you can do something differently for them. And I want you all to be a winner. This is a shift, and it creates an incredible opportunity to be the world's best practitioner, which you all are. So what's the model? So the shift that started in the food industry came when the tobacco industry got hold of the processed food industry, and it happened like that. 1985, 85, 88, within that fewer period, tobacco controlled 10% of every American food purchase. So what did they do immediately? Because they're so good at it. They were starting to get beat up in the courts, the tobacco industry, so they needed a new industry to move into. They moved into processed foods. They applied the modern industrial epidemic of addiction model. This is a known model. There's actually a research paper published on this business model. It is a business model. Did I mention it's a business model? It's a business model, right? So soon, millions had made the shift from eating to addiction, food addiction. They were not eating anymore, they were using. So what is the model? First of all, you teach the brain to crave. So particularly the addiction neurons are very vulnerable to training. That means they only have to see something one time before they not only know about that, but they know about everything, every cue, every trigger, everything associated with that. And they really know about processed foods because it's an addiction and a food. So it's like a double whammy. Very, very easy to teach the brain to crave. All you have to do is an addictive product, advertise the heck out of it so you get a lot of impressions, and market to the youngest possible age. So who remembers the Joe Camel cigarette campaign? Youngest possible age, 10-year-old boy. Congress at that time stepped in and actually stopped that campaign. Tragically effective. What is the other thing you need to do is you need to remove barriers to use. It doesn't do any good if the product costs $50,000. Nobody is going to get addicted to a $50,000 product. You can't use it often enough. This is Pavlovian conditioning of neurons. You can't use it often enough to condition the neuron. So why did cigarettes become so wildly popular? It was because of the invention of the rolling machine. So before you had the rolling machine, you had people lined up in cigarette factories manually rolling cigarettes, and they were expensive. But once you had a rolling machine, you could get the cost of a pack of cigarettes down to a nickel. And then you could addict people to the nicotine. So you've got to remove barriers to use, which means you have to make it available everywhere. You can just reach out on impulse and pick it up and start using it, and you have to make it cheap. So these are the 5 A's of this business model. It's a business model, in case I didn't mention that. It just works. So who uses this model? Well, we know tobacco uses it to market to teenagers. Alcohol companies use it to market to teenage girls. So we have an epidemic of alcoholism among teenage girls in Canada because Canada has a low drinking age, 18, and it's the whole country. So the alcohol industry said, yeah, girls, Canada, alcohol. And off they went. The pharmaceuticals use this model to market to doctors, opiates, and we know the consequences of that. Now we see tobacco and alcohol moving into marijuana in Canada. So both of these industries, tobacco and alcohol, have made big purchases of marijuana companies in Canada. And we see tobacco moving into vaping. It's a business model, and the tobacco industry is the best at it. When at the height of smoking, 2/3 of American adults smoked. 2/3. Epidemic. They can do it. They have the ability to do that. So now they're outrageous. 13 times bigger than tobacco is the food industry, and they're marketing. Finally, they get to the youngest consumer, a newborn baby. They can even get really to the fetus via the mother, right? Give her sugar, then the baby's born addicted and never stops. So how this just works. It is hijacking normal brain function for profit. Let's look at some examples. Here's infant formula that is 52% sugar and high fructose corn syrup. Toddler cereal, 40 to 70. I didn't have the nerve to put 70% in the title, but there is one study that identified some 70% sugar toddler cereal. Using idols. If Spider-Man eats it, it must be good. Over and over again. Toys in fast food meals are so effective that San Francisco banned the use of toys in fast food meals. But here's the biggie. Here's television. So how does this work? Here, this graph is the number of Saturday morning cartoon ads for sugary, fatty, salty food. Now, in 1987, when tobacco is just moving into the processed food industry, there are already 160 ads per Saturday morning. But within a couple of years, there are 264. And within a few years after that, there are 564 ads per Saturday morning for sugary, fatty, salty foods. Highly addictive food-like substances to toddlers. Okay. So it only takes 5 commercials to influence a toddler's choice. This is research done at Stanford's. They took 2 groups of toddlers. One watched a program with no commercials. The other watched a program with 5 commercials. Then they put all the toddlers in a room with lots of different products. And the toddlers who had seen the 5 commercials went for that product. And the toddlers who had not seen the commercial picked out a whole bunch of different toys. 5 commercials. It only takes 5 commercials. And they're getting 500 on a Saturday morning. Nickelodeon carried these commercials to 65 million households. So when I say to you, oh, it's an epidemic of addiction, you're like, oh, that's not possible. It's extremely possible. It's tragically possible. How did it work? Well, here you see. Obesity rates in the age 2 to 19 and 1988, it's a 10% prevalence. By 1999, it's a 15% prevalence. That is a 50% increase in 10 years. Worked tragically well. So how else do they do it? Availability and advertising. So you just see this explosion of grocery stores from your local IGA to Costco. Now, this 60% of store purchases are unplanned. What that means is that the person isn't intending to buy something, but they get inside the intense bombardment of queuing inside a grocery store, and they buy more than double what they were planning to buy. So the grocery industry is clearly dependent on bombarding people with queues when they come into a grocery store. Vending machines, same model as cigarettes. So when cigarettes were at their height, you never worried about not having a pack because you could buy one anywhere. Anywhere. Not a problem. Availability on the road, and then convenience stores. So why convenience stores? Because teenagers are driving. They get the car and they learn to drive, and they're at the gas station. And why not bombard these young people with advertising? And they're free, their parents aren't there to tell them what to do. So they really honed in on convenience stores at gas stations. They weren't always there. It used to be a gas station had gas. And the model for this is incredibly exploitive. So the person who is kind of like an indentured servant because they've gotten into this lease, an onerous lease that can't possibly work, they don't get anything out of the gas. They just get the revenue from the convenience store, and they're stuck there. But here's really a market change. So when I went into the corporate world in 1978, nobody would eat in a meeting. If you ate at your desk, you hid it. Because if you ate in a meeting, it's only because you're a wuss. You didn't even drink water. Like, nobody drank water in a meeting. You drank coffee. You could put sugar and cream in it, but you drank coffee. And now we have just these break rooms that are filled with this crap. People tell me all the time, they sit at their desk all day long and they crave the stuff that's in the break room and the vending machines. So these employers, oh yeah, I provide free snacks for my employees. I'm such a good employer. Metabolic syndrome? No? Okay. And of course the schools don't even get me started. But here's a really cool thing about when you get this addiction model in mind, suddenly the whole world makes sense. Here we are on Hong Kong University campus. This is spreading like wildfire. The corporations are very good at spreading addiction around the world. And here are all these students and teachers and whoever stuck. They are stuck. They need to be studying, they need to be with their students, and when you're on a university campus, time is everything, because how hard you work is how the grades you make and the grants you get and everything. Look at these people, they're all stuck in this line in the rain. They're not going anywhere, and that is the power of an addiction. So an addiction is like having a sociopathic narcissist in your head, kind of. The sociopathic narcissist in the head says, I'm first. I get whatever I want, no matter what anybody else wants. I get what I want. You want to go study? No. We're going to get some coffee. You want to go talk to your students? I'd like to go talk to my students. No. We're going to get some coffee. So it's just so crucial to know this. If you only take one thing away from this whole talk, it's that when somebody comes in front of you, they are seeking help because, this is not just my own opinion, it's based on research, and we're going to come to that. It's because they're addicted, and they can't stop. If they could stop, they would stop. If they would actually refer to one of the 800 diet books that they've read, and they would follow instructions. But they're like, I want to follow this diet book. No! We're having donuts. What's wrong with you? Okay, donuts it is. That's an addiction. That's what's going through these, well, not exactly, but that's what an addiction is like. So addiction, the word addiction comes from the same root as dictator. And if you really go way back, it's the root of the word for slavery. So an addiction is the process of coming under the control of a dictator. So this is a sociopathic, narcissistic dictator inside the head. And you can see this on MRI images. The release of craving neurotransmitters from the addiction pathways is so great that it takes over the whole brain. The whole rest of the brain just stops working, and we're going to get to that. Okay. So the affordability deal and the packaging deal is just like cigarettes. You don't want to sell somebody one cigarette and then have to market and sell them another cigarette. And that you need them to have it right here and be able to do that repeat use. This is then morphed into a grazing routine. Somebody mentioned this the other day. 20 cigarettes a day, 20, eating 20 times a day. It's the same pattern. It's a grazing pattern. It's not a binging pattern. It's a grazing pattern. So you don't buy one soda, you buy 12. And then you get the next one free, so that there are sodas inside the house, because availability is a huge trigger. If you know something is there, your dopamine pathway, not with your cooperation, this is the narcissistic dictator, will just start leaking dopamine. I can't stop thinking about the blah, blah, blah. I can't stop thinking about the donuts. I can't, why did it's in the break room, and I know where the vending machine is, and I got to get some work done. No. We're going to think about food. No, you can't get any work done. No. So this is what this is like. Dollar meals are just like craving bait. And here's how it works. So here's the substance piece of it. Sugar activates the same pathway as L-DOPA. So the dopamine pathway is named after an addictive painkiller, L-DOPA. Flour sets off serotonin. Gluten attaches to the opiate receptors. Does the same thing as opium at a much lower level until you eat a lot of it, and then it can make you pass out. Excessive salt also activates the opiate pathways, and dairy activates the... Dairy has 4 different casomorphines in it. It's designed to put a baby cow to sleep. Processed fats activate the same pathway as marijuana. So this is a pathway that's named after cannabis because the researchers saw that when people smoked marijuana, oh, that part of the brain lights up. And then another researcher says, wow, it's the same part of the brain that wakes up for processed fats. Isn't that interesting? And then caffeine, of course, wakes up dopamine. And then it's whatever else the tobacco industry, the tobacco industry added sugar to tobacco as it was drying. The tobacco industry added things to make even low tar cigarettes make you think that you were smoking a regular tar cigarette. So food additives, they don't have to put them on the label. They don't. So how could it be an epidemic? How could it be an epidemic? Could we all have food addiction? Well, if the highest lawyers at the most prestigious law firms have food addiction, maybe we could all have it. So how did this work? So when the tobacco industry came in, they said, we want a snack industry. Yeah. And the people in the company said, well, people don't really buy snacks because they're not hungry. They get what they need to eat in meals. And the tobacco industry said, well, we'll take care of that. And what they came up with, desire. So hunger does not sell snacks, but desire sells snacks. And there it is. There's the switch from eating to addiction right there. So how did this work? Well, there was a guy, Howard Moskowitz, Harvard-trained, PhD, psychology of marketing. Dangerous. So Howard was a data jock. He just loved data. And he figured out a process by which he could jack up sugar in processed foods right to the point where consumers said, this is too sugary. And he collected data from thousands of people, and they tested thousands of products, and he developed this whole methodology for jacking up the sugar. Remember, high fructose corn syrup, invented at about the same time. So he could fill, it used to be bread, and now it's sugar in a bread casing. And then 2 other inventions. Now, these are good people. These are not bad people. Adam Dronowski, right here at University of Washington, discovered that you could put as much fat in a product as you wanted, and people wouldn't mind. They would keep buying it. Fat, remember, activates the same pathway as cannabis. And then in the Monell Chemical Senses Center, they know that babies are not born with a preference for salt. Babies are born with a preference for sugar. But you could teach babies to have a preference for salt if you put enough salt in their food. Lunchables. Okay. So that was the science of how they turned food into addictive food-like substances. Now, one thing the food industry knows is that when you process foods, you take all the taste, color, texture out of it. It's just something that's grossly unappealing. So you have to fill it back up again with sugar, fat, salt to give it taste and texture. Hey, those substances are addictive. This is a no-brainer. And that's what happened. That is what happened. Did it work? Yeah. So why did I choose these 2 years, 1970 and 1997? Because this is when obesity exploded. I said, I want the before and the after for that period. Now, you can't find these figures on the internet. You can look all day long, you cannot find these. How did I get these? Well, I opened up the USDA consumption statistics, and I dug way down into the statistics, and I added it up for those 2 years. So there it is. And I got to tell you, I also looked for meat. I looked for beans. I looked for rice. I looked for vegetables. And none of those changed in the rise of obesity. These are the foods that changed dramatically. Sugars, caloric sugars, flour, frozen potatoes for French fries, and high-fat dairy. High-fat dairy, just think about high-fat dairy for a second. It's got 4 casomorphines, and it lights up the endocannabinoid pathway. Oh, let's put cheese on everything, you know. Think about the 3 major fast food chains. They contain all 7 of the major categories of addictive foods. And then think about the next one, which is the Asian. They don't have cheese. I don't think the Asian fast food chains are ever going to take over the taco, hamburger, or pizza ones, because they don't have cheese. So how addictive are these substances? Well, we know it only takes 7 days for sugar, a 30% sugar solution, to start to modify brain functioning in a rat. And what's really interesting, it starts with the locomotion center. It says, like, well, before I get over here to the craving center, I got to make sure that we got control of the I'm going to get it center. Locomotion, first center to change. Rats will choose sugar over cocaine. And we do have a study that when sugar is injected into the nose of a rat, it will reach the dopamine pathways faster and activate them with a greater output of dopamine than cocaine. And we talked about the French fries, yeah. So sugar, fat, salt. So French fries are encased in sugar, and they are encased in, they're sprayed with maltodextrin so that they all taste the same no matter what time of year it is. Like sometimes potatoes have greater sugar content than other times of year, but fast food French fry will taste the same all year round because they spray it with sugar. They add salt, and then a tremendous amount of fat. It's like the perfect storm of addictive substance. And then you put it in a meal that's got all the other addictive substances in that meal, including a sugary caffeinated drink, flour in the bun. You know, they've got it covered. It's a highly addictive substance. This is not alcoholism. This is much, 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 much worse. And it's everywhere. So this is how we ended up. We had a 30, here we go. So we're a pound per person per day. A pound per person per day. If you can remember 2 things, and I know we've already forgot the first thing. But the second thing is a pound per person per day. This is a lot easier to remember. A pound per person per day of caloric sweeteners. That means it doesn't include artificial sweeteners. Flour, wheat flour containing gluten, and corn flour, high-fat dairy, and French fries. Per person, per day. Now, I did notice about, maybe a year or so after I dug, and this took a long time to pull these statistics out, find them, pull them out, get the years, add them up. I noticed that the food industry was trying to get the USDA to stop collecting these statistics. Oh man, this is really bad. The USDA was able to resist that one. So we have a 37% increase in these highly addictive substances. We have 0% increase, virtually 0 by comparison, in any other of the real foods. This is it. This is what caused the obesity epidemic. And I'm willing to stand up here and use the word caused, which scientists aren't supposed to use. So the neuromarketing works effectively, and then of course we have the ensuing epidemics. Just like we had millions of people dying from lung cancer, now we have millions of people. We know that processed foods are now the leading cause of preventable death. Are they the leading cause of death, period, on the planet now? Anyway, so lots of suffering. The obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and I will say over the 23 years now that I've been doing this, I did finally figure out a way to get people reliably off of processed foods. I discovered it last year as a result of writing the textbook. I did finally get there. So now it's really stark that all these things just go away. They just go away. When you get people off these processed foods, all of those things just go away. I just got to talk to Eric Westman at breakfast, and I'm prepared to stand here and say something that I don't think will shock anybody in the room, which is over the 23 years that I've been doing this, I would say I have seen every disease go away. Now, not cancer, and not type 1 diabetes, and not anything that's been surgically removed. We can't grow things back yet. I've seen everything else go away. This is like a slow poison. So, of course, I think that a lot of the reason why keto is so effective is because you and the processed food community, the food addiction recovery community, these are the only two communities on the private that get the processed foods out. So I do think that that's a big factor in why we're here today. How does it work for the brain? Well, there are 4 parts of the brain that are affected. Limbic system craze. There's a stress pathway that stresses. There's a frontal lobe that crashes. There are mirror neurons that copy addictive use. This is how it works. The limbic system is in charge of, oh, this feels good. I like this. But then as it progresses, it gets into cravings, obsession, and then the addiction is, I'm doing something I don't want to do. The stress pathway is a very recent finding that the stress pathway is activated by the craving pathway. Corticotropin releasing factor pathway sends signals to the adrenal gland to release corticosterol and cortisol. You start out by worrying a little bit extra, progresses to anxiety, stress, fear, panic, and then you're stress eating, you're panic eating. The frontal lobe just gets, all the resources are going over here to craving. Frontal lobe is like a higher level thinking, and the brain says, okay, we don't need higher level thinking right now, we need cravings because of the narcissistic addiction. So all of these things just stop happening. There's not enough blood flow, and you can see this on, these are PET scans, brain scans. You can see the frontal lobe stops firing during massive cravings. Computer has crashed. So attention deficit and learning problems and poor decision making, memory loss, impulse control loss, satiation loss, emotional processing loss. These are all because the frontal lobe is not getting enough blood supply for hundreds of millions of people. Now, mirror neurons, this is where I would ask you to pay attention. They do one thing, and that is copy. These are the copycat neurons. And we have great ones because for hundreds of thousands of years, when the tribe ran, we ran. The impulse in the brain goes straight from mirror neurons to locomotion. It doesn't go to the frontal lobe and say, let's think about this. Do we want to run? No. The people who just had that malfunction and it went to the frontal lobe, oh, do I want to run? I'm kind of busy right now. Do I want to run? Womp, the predator got them. They didn't live to procreate. We don't have those genes. We have the run genes. We have the if they're doing it, copy it genes. So survive, run, look for foods, hide. Whatever the tribe is doing, do it. And of course, the processed food industry says, oh, everybody's eating processed foods, so you eat processed foods too. All this adds up to neuromarketing. And just to recap, it's what we talked about. It's the advertising and all those things that we've talked about. Okay, we've belabored this. Now, normally a brain has a braking system. You look at that gross processed food, it goes to the limbic system. The limbic says, wow, that looks really good. And the frontal lobe, but it checks it out with the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe says, no, it's almost dinner. Our doctor said not to eat that. Cool. Neuromarketing cuts the brakes. So over repeated stimulation, remember all those cartoons, ads, the limbic system hyperactivates. And it pulls the blood supply away from the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe says, instead of saying, no, the doctor said not to eat that, you get this craving pathway, remember, narcissistic, that looks great. And the frontal lobe saying, no, thank you. No, thank you. No. Not working. So then, of course, the next thing that we talked about is stress increases incredibly. The irony, of course, is that stress further activates the craving pathway. This is stress eating. Frontal lobe is now just like completely out of the picture. Dieting makes the whole thing worse. It really activates the famine, survival parts of the brain, and the limbic system is now really hyperactivated. So the other part of the brain that the food stimulation is reaching is the mirror neurons. Everybody's eating processed foods, so we're going to be eating processed foods too. Now you have what I call the Bermuda Triangle of addiction, which is you have the mirror neurons, the stress pathways, and the craving pathways all lined up to do the same thing, which is to eat compulsively. And that is where people's lives are lost. Because I want to go to school, or I'd like to play with my kids. No. There's no room in the brain for that. Plus, they're sick. Now, the next phase of this is something, one researcher caught this, and this is the key to everything. So it's, when you get stressed and cravings activating all the time, you get this thing called thought fusion, where you can't think about one without the other. Thought fusion is really horrible, and it goes something like this. Well, I want to eat, but I don't want to eat. But I just say, well, I'll just have one bite. Oh my God, I ate the whole thing. Now I'm going to have to go to the grocery store. I'm going to buy it. I have to replace that, and then I'll get 2 more, and I'll hide those in the laundry room. And I hate myself. And gosh, I hope nobody sees me. I'll just have one bite. But oh my God, I ate the whole thing. All day long. All day long. From the moment they wake up until the moment they go to sleep. So here you are. You're the practitioner. They come in to see you. You've got this incredibly insightful advice. Eat keto, eat clean. I went to school for all this time, and I know exactly what to tell you, and I've got this whole notebook for you. And are you ready? So ready? Eat clean. This is where it goes. Into that memory bank. Yeah. So this is why, guys. This is why. This is why your clients quit, why they can't get started, why they're embarrassed to come back, why they come back, and then you're like, what do you mean you didn't start? This is what's going on. They need to learn a lot. I mean, over the 23 years that I've been doing this, this is not a small shift for a human being. They're going to have to basically leave westernized culture and go to a foreign country, make all new friends, because everybody around them is stuck in this. They got a lot to learn, but learning has crashed. So what are we going to do? We're going to flip the mirror neurons. We're going to get those mirror neurons back from the friggin' food industry and give them back to our clients. So if Robert Mueller can flip witnesses, we can flip mirror neurons. Okay, so this is how it works. You know, when you get a mirror neuron to focus on a new tribe, which is exactly what I'm doing with Zoom platforms. This is my breakthrough. Okay, I'm going to be talking about this in San Diego. How do you do this? How do you do this? How do you do this? But this is what you can accomplish. The mirror neurons are, remember, they're more powerful than every other system in the brain. So you can cut down the cueing on the craving pathway, and you can get mirror neurons to override the whole rest of the brain, and I'm serious. I've seen this. And it doesn't take very long. It's unbelievably effective. So that when you get this neurostimulation, the mirror neurons in charge of the brain now, they say, are you kidding? My tribe doesn't eat that. What's wrong with you? And it's a completely different message. It comes from a completely different part of the brain. It's not the no, I shouldn't eat that. My doctor said I shouldn't eat that. Well, I'll just have one bite. No, it's a completely different message, and it comes from the most powerful part of the brain. Frontal cortex is actually the weakest part of the brain. It's new. It doesn't have anything to do with survival. It's higher level thinking. So whenever the brain is going to choose which part of the brain to activate, they're going to go to mirror neurons first. Which is why you see all these ads of people sitting on sofas eating snack food in the commercials. Okay, mirror neurons are very fickle, and here's what makes Zoom like the savior of the universe. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Zoom.us? The video sharing platform where you can just be eyeball to eyeball to somebody else. It's eyeball to eyeball that actually activates the mirror neurons. So they're going to be copying the last people they see, which means if the last people they see were eating bad foods, mirror neurons are going to kill that person. But if the last people they saw were eating great foods, mirror neurons are absolutely going to save that person's life. Do you see how that works? Just go like this. Thank you. Okay, so if you're around healthy people and then mirror neurons are creating health. If you are around bad eating people, then your mirror neurons are killing you. They're creating disease. So how do you do it? You need a couple of very specific things. You need more than 5 people. This has been replicated in very different research, but the mirror neurons don't really start firing until they're looking at 5 people. They need a tribe, okay? They need to be people that person knows well. You get 5 complete strangers, it's like, I don't know those people, I'm not doing what they're doing. But if you expose the mirror neurons to these 5 people a lot, it's like, oh, I'm getting to know these people. Now I know these people. Now I'll do what they're doing. And then if the person is doing something if the 5 people are doing something that the person has done a lot of, then they're much more likely to follow that. And if it involves food, they're much more likely to actually do what those 5 people are doing, which is just desperately what you want them to do. Okay, so this explains why people quit and why they can't start. So let's use the comparison to smoking to really understand, because this is very hard to get your head wrapped around, but if you can cut through this whole addiction model, how it works if you do one thing, which whenever you say processed foods, you replace that with processed foods and cigarettes. And then you will start to see it. Then it'll start to make sense. So in the overeating model, we have emotional eating, we have eating disorders, we have childhood issues, we have lazy, we have make the stomach smaller. But in the smoking model, you don't have emotional smoking. You have friggin' addiction. It's nicotine driving that behavior. You don't have a breathing disorder. You have nicotine addiction. You are not smoking because of trauma. You're smoking because you have nicotine addiction. And you're not just smoking to lose weight, although people do that. They're smoking because they have an addiction. And making the trachea smaller is not going to help. So what is, use the shift. Use the shift. Just remember, go back to the 1980s. Okay, we're dealing with substances. Overeating is not, this is the old model. Lack of willpower, gluttony, none of those things. It is, I have had the wrong diagnosis. I have not been diagnosing my patients and clients properly. Dieting makes this worse. These people need a lot more support. Like, we offer 5 hours a day of live interaction in our community. People have cognitive impairments. You cannot teach them. Don't teach them and then blame them for not learning. That part of the brain is not working. Get them in a place where they can copy. They have kidnapped mirror neurons. Get those back. Just remember, never, ever, ever blame a client. If I have a client that's struggling, I'm like, what can I do? 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 I never say to that person, try harder. No, No, I'm missing something in my program. There's a gap in my program that I have created. I need to fill that gap, and then that client will do fine. Okay, so just remember, it's going to be, who's going to have control of your client's mirror neurons? It's either going to be the neuromarketers, or it's going to be you. I'm not exaggerating. So it's either going to be stress, crave, buy, or it's going to be protect and store. You guys can do this. You can do this. It's a great business model, by the way. You can add a really significant amount of revenue to your business. I'm working really hard right now on the marketing of this community. So make the shift. Fight like a neuromarketer. Get your client, if you're a client, just find these people in your lives and spend hours with them on Zoom. If you're a practitioner, set up these online support meetings and give new people hope.